Plurilogue Talks is a conversational space between artists and social scientists that are based in the region, in Arabic, English, and other languages. Our exchange takes the form of a plurilogue, a dialogue that goes beyond two sides. I just wanted to say a quick welcome to Plurilogue Talks. I'm really very pleased to welcome Wafa Alsayed, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow at GUST, the Gulf University for Science and Technology, which is based in Kuwait. She recently finished her PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE, and previously she had done her undergraduate and master's degrees at Georgetown University. I got to know Wafa mainly through some fantastic blog posts that she had written about her work on Arab intellectuals in the Gulf region and the work that they produced, often in archives that are not well circulated within kind of academic writings on the Gulf. And I was a little bit curious, and then I found out that she was a friend of mine, who then introduced us on email. And I thought, what a wonderful opportunity to be able to kind of share not only some of her findings, but also some of her process of how she went about gathering those archives, because they're really kind of very different sorts. Some of them are formal government archives, publications, but many of them are not. And so really, I wanted to welcome her here today so she can tell us a little bit about her research. Much of this was formed during her doctoral dissertation, which she's now developing into a series of publications. And I just wanted to mention that generally what we do when we have a small group is actually we go around the room and each person can just introduce themselves and say what brings them to this group. What is it that you're seeking to kind of learn or know? And that way, hopefully, we can have a little bit of a dialogical exchange. So maybe if I can start with Shamoon.
I'm not really an expert in the region, although I started at CASA. My interest is in photography, but I'm not a scholar of regional culture or Arabic. My main field is American intellectual history, photography, and literature.
Thank you, Shamoon. Laure?
I'm Laure Assaf. I'm working in Arab crossroads studies and social research and public policy. I work actually on Abu Dhabi, mainly on topics of urbanity, youth, and belonging in the UAE. And so I'm very excited to hear this talk.
Thanks, Laure. Sagar?
I'm a humanities research fellow, and I do translation, gender, and trans studies.
Great. Thank you so much, Sagar. And Ban Qattan?
I'm Ban Qattan, and I'm research associate at Haraka Lab within Al Mawrid Center.
I see one last name, Lian.
Hi, I'm Layan Al-Hussein. I'm a MFA student at NYU. It's a new program.
Thank you so much, Lian. So it sounds like we have a really fantastic group of people here today. And, you know, it took us a while to get to Wafa, but I'm not going to delay this any further. I really just wanted to say that in many ways, the center that Salwa runs at Mawrid has a really important mandate in kind of thinking through how does one decenter art history in the kind of Arab region. And in joining her in this work through Haraka Lab, I hope to do the same thing and really kind of learn a little bit more about what kind of archives exist in the Gulf region that we can draw on to tell different kinds of stories. And I think, Wafa, your work, although very much in political science and in IR specifically, has essentially sort of done this thing. So you, I think, are attempting to decenter dominant approaches in IR that look at the Gulf as a place where you can really, for example, understand foreign policy by dismissing domestic politics or overlooking them completely as if there is nothing there. That had been the dominant approach. And your work actually allows us to see something a little bit different. And so I would love to pass the floor on to you now to share with us. We had a very ambitious agenda of covering both Kuwait and Bahrain, but I think Wafa today will focus primarily on Kuwait, but we'll be more than happy to take questions on Bahrain after the talk.
Thank you very much, May, for this very generous and kind introduction. In 1966, Kuwait's ruler Sabah al-Salim visited Bahrain. British documents describe a disagreement that arose between him and the Bahraini ruler. Sheikh Sabah was struck by the degree to which Sheikh Isa attended to the British officials at the dinner party held in his honor, and he made his opinions clear in a private meeting with the ruler. Sheikh Isa reported back to the British that Sheikh Sabah questioned Bahrain's overall policy towards the British by asking, why did he pay so much obvious respect to the British? Why did he walk down the majlis to greet first the political agent and then the political resident when they arrived from the dinner party? Why did he place the political resident next to the emir both before and during the dinner? Why was the British commandment of police present at the dinner? It is apparent that Kuwait's ruler found it important that an Arab ruler must adhere to a certain pan-Arab code of conduct when dealing with a Western power. Why was this the case? I think the answer lies in a detailed examination of Kuwait's distinct dynamics of state identity, the state and identity formation, which can help us understand better its foreign policy. In my presentation today, I will first highlight the shortcomings of the scholarship on Gulf international relations. Then I will outline my methodological approach in studying Kuwait's foreign policy and draw on some of my research findings. And then I will investigate the motivations behind Kuwait's adoption of an Arabist, progressive, and anti-colonial policy in the 60s and the 70s. Finally, I will describe my use of often neglected local sources in my research. So first, one of the main shortcomings of Gulf international relations is the limited attention it pays to the historical, ideational, and domestic dynamics and their role in shaping a state's external behavior. This is due to the enduring legacy of rational and neorealist theories within international relations in general, which I won't get into much now. So recently, some international relations studies did begin to incorporate ideas of historical sociology, feminism, post-colonialism, and postmodernism. But when it comes to Gulf international relations, the neorealist systemic approaches remain dominant. So second, given Kuwait's adoption of a pan-Arab foreign policy in the 60s and the 70s, I also engaged with the literature on Arabism in international relations. And this literature, I believe, places too much emphasis on the role of inter-Arab state interactions and defining the norms of Arabism amongst them, while overlooking the role of domestic interactions and dialogues between the political elite and members of society within Arab states. They also tend to understand a decision maker's approach and adherence to pan-Arab ideas as mainly an instrumentalist policy, responding to regional and at times internal threats. They see these ideas simply as tools to be manipulated by the political elite within the state. And third, the current literature on Kuwait's foreign policy lacks an in-depth historical investigation of the factors that inform the ideational motivations driving decision makers' behavior. There's a need to address both the historical and the ideational legacies that have shaped Kuwait's foreign policy. And this is not really possible with the currently dominant approach of realism. Most works on Kuwait's foreign policy also rely heavily on British and American archives. While I've engaged with this material, I also incorporate a wide range of Arabic language, primary and secondary sources. So these studies tend to frame Kuwait's foreign policy merely as a reaction to Iraqi threat on sovereignty. And of course, Kuwait's unsettled border with Iraq and the threats that came out of that did shape Kuwait's threat perceptions and security arrangements. But the heavy focus on this issue of Kuwaiti-Iraqi relations leads to an underestimation of the role of internal dynamics in shaping external behavior. So we see domestic developments and popular influences definitely shape the perceptions and the behavior of Kuwaiti policymakers. And I have to say that formal institutional channels are not the only mediums through which popular forces can influence foreign policy. And I scrutinize the broader processes that determine Kuwait's external behavior. Many studies also highlight that Kuwait's choice to rely on British and American security guarantees following independence demonstrates this insincere adherence to pan-Arab ideals. And I argue that this is a very superficial understanding. It does not recognize how Kuwait's behavior actually differed significantly from other Gulf states like Bahrain on the same point. So in my research, I'm interested in understanding the motivations behind Kuwait's foreign policy in the 60s and the 70s. and I investigate how Kuwait came to adopt what I describe as a pan-Arab progressive and anti-colonial foreign policy through a theoretical approach that combines historical sociology with constructivism. Through historical sociology, I identify the origins of the states and changes in the material and structural forces of Kuwait, and constructivism allows me to uncover the ideational influences. So I do it in 3 steps. First, I do the history of state formation in Kuwait, and I demonstrate how the government consolidated its authority. Then I explain how these processes of state building led to the formation of distinct identities, both at the levels of the state as well as society. And finally, I trace the relationship between history and ideas and foreign policy. So the first step in my research disentangles the complex historical relationships and interactions between different state institutions, ruling elites, and other political and societal communities. It is important to examine this through a historicized lens to scrutinize the changing impact of the international and regional environments on state institutions. The first theme is the historical relationship between the Al-Sabah and society, which was a central factor in determining Kuwait's political culture. Traditional accounts hold that Kuwait's powerful merchant class elected the Al-Sabah as rulers, marking the latter as first amongst equals, and this relationship continued to define domestic politics even after the discovery of oil, which provided the Al-Sabah with an independent form of income and ended their reliance on trade dues. So Kuwait's tradition of popular participation in governance gave rise to a relatively strong pro-democracy tradition within the state and society. And after independence, the legacy of consultative government influenced Kuwait's foreign policy policy and decision-making process, enabling the participation of progressive and pan-Arabist elements in the foreign ministry, but also facilitated the relatively free movement of ideas such as Arab nationalism between society and the decision makers. And then a second important theme that I explore is the role of external powers in Kuwait's modernization. The British colonial presence in Kuwait was relatively weak if we compare it to the rest of the Gulf. Kuwait only became important to the Gulf, I would say, after the discovery of oil in 1938. And by that time, Kuwait already had established its own nascent state institutions. And we see, for example, beginning in 1942, the Egyptian government was sending teachers, judges, and doctors and other experts to work in Kuwait state institutions. And after the 1948 Nakba as well, large numbers of highly skilled Palestinians refugees took up leading positions in many government departments. The relative weakness of the British influence in domestic affairs, in contrast to the growing influence of the Arab states and expatriates on state institutions, allowed these Arab ideas to acquire greater currency in government departments, a feature that endured in Kuwait's post-independence ministries, including the foreign ministry. And the third theme explores the nature of the formation and evolution of state institutions. Kuwait's state institutions were characterized by their representativeness, decentralization, as well as Arabist influences. The representativeness of early institutions secured a prominent role for society and government. Additionally, state centralization created institutional avenues in which pan-Arab ideas dominated some government departments. And we see competing sheikhs taking in charge of these different institutions and ruling them as powerful fiefdoms. And therefore, these contending sheikhs would compete for authority by allying with popular forces, resulting in the infiltration of popular pan-Arab, anti-colonial, and progressive ideational discourses into the state apparatus. By independence, the above influences to a large extent shaped Kuwait's political identity, which in turn guided its foreign policy. The second step in my research recovers the identities that emerge from these historical and material themes. Arabism and political progressiveness and democracy were powerful ideas, but I will just focus on the Arabist discourse today. In both the pre-independence and post-independence period, I would say this was one of the foremost dominant discursive trend within state and society. My examination from various sources from the 50s, like magazines and newspapers, shows that a main component of Kuwaiti society saw itself first as Arab and Kuwaiti as second. So society understood the concepts of Kuwaiti and Arab to be mutually inclusive, and made Kuwait's relations with the Arab world and its response to various Arab crises, focal issues in the public's imagination, and underlined the public's understanding that Kuwait's foreign policy interests should correspond with society's pan-Arab preferences. Pan-Arab advocacy was also important within this discourse, focusing on the Suez Crisis in Egypt, Algeria's anti-colonial struggle, and the Palestinian cause. Pro-Egyptian rhetoric was also prevalent, stressing revolutionary Egypt's central role in the Arab world and its pan-Arab, anti-colonial, and anti-Israeli campaigns. The examined texts strongly support the establishment of the United Arab Republic in 1958. There's a lot of praise and admiration for President Jamal Abdel Nasser. And for Kuwaiti society in the 1950s, asserting an Arab identity was also an integral part of anti-colonial struggle. The press focused on anti-colonial movements in various Arab regions, including the Gulf, cemented society's Arab nationalist narrative. In the 1950s, on the official level, the ruling elite also represented Kuwait's identity as Arab first and at times espousing a strong Arab nationalist approach. This reflects the degree of engagement between the Al-Sabah and popular pan-Arab ideas in society. This means that they were mirroring some of these societal ideational norms when discussing Kuwait's political identity and position in the Arab world. Arabist ideas were prominent in specific government publications and certain state institutions, especially the education department. So in the post-independence period, Arabism remains a dominant discourse, with both members of society and the government continuing to embrace Arab nationalist ideas. The state officially adopted an Arab identity, acting upon it in various Arab crises in the 60s and the 70s. And pan-Arab attitudes also led to popular support for Arab unity, especially during the popular campaign for Kuwait's entry into the unity talks with Egypt, Syria, and Iraq in 1963. The examination of various sources from the 50s up until the late 70s demonstrate this clear continuity of pan-Arab rhetoric, both amongst the public and members of the political elite. So following this historical analysis and this ideational analysis, which I briefly covered, I do the kind of like the history, analyzing the foreign policy then of Kuwait. And this is the third step of my research. So in the 60s and the 70s, I analyzed how Kuwait pursued then a pan-Arab and progressive and anti-colonial foreign policy. With regards to the pan-Arab aspect, not only did Kuwait strongly support Arab causes, but also actively mediated inter-Arab disputes, particularly the Saudi-Egyptian tensions. It also resisted certain forms of Western influence in the region, despite occasionally courting the US and the UK. And Kuwait's foreign policy also strongly opposed colonialism through embracing third worldism and the non-aligned movement. So two principal goals, I think, guided Kuwait's foreign policy during this period. First, protecting its sovereignty from external incursions. And the second is improving its position within the Arab and developing worlds through pan-Arabist and progressive policies. And in spite of the fact that we may say that these two goals kind of conflict with each other, I think when we compare it to other Arab Gulf states, we see that the country, Kuwait, appears to be less Western and more proactive in its pan-Arab progressive and non-aligned foreign policy. In fact, during the 60s and 70s, Kuwait was quite resistant to a strong alliance with Western powers, and it frequently criticized American and British foreign policies towards the Arab world, and at times strained its relationship with these states. One of the main cases exemplifying Kuwait's pan-Arab foreign policy is its commitment to the Palestinian issue. The pan-Arab discourse I just highlighted translated into a proactive policies, including support for the Palestinian national movement. In 1964, it opened the PLO office, and as the birthplace of Fatah, it also served as the organization's headquarters until 1966 and its main center in the Gulf afterwards. Kuwaiti commitment to the issue is especially evident during the Arab-Israeli wars of 67 and 73, where Kuwait in 1967, through its support behind the Arab states directly affected by the conflict, it dispatched a symbolic military contingent to Egypt, and the ruler declared the war against, quote, Zionist gangs in occupied Palestine, end quote. Kuwait also played a leading role in the 1967 and 73 oil embargoes, which frustrated the British at the time. The British voiced concern over Kuwait's radio reporting of the 1967 war, alleging that it, quote, relayed the slanders of Cairo more prominently than Western denials of involvement, end quote. After 67, the Kuwaiti government received Palestinian refugees and allowed the PLO to operate schools for their children to ease pressure on the government schools. And the extracurricular activities of these schools included providing children with paramilitary and political training. Also, aid policy is an integral part of Kuwait's foreign policy. I'm not going to be able to get into as much details, but happy to cover that in the Q&A. And even though part of that is motivated by the Iraqi threats, which kind of motivated Kuwait to gain allies in the region, but this was not the sole reason for its aid policy. Rather, Kuwait's aid policy complemented its Arabist and non-aligned foreign policy, especially through its financial support for Arab governments that other Arab monarchies deemed threatening, such as South Yemen. Also, I would argue that its earlier aid policy towards the lower Gulf states before independence was part of that pan-Arab idea as well. I would like to conclude my presentation with a brief overview of the sources that I have used in my research. I argue that these sources, which are ignored or deemed insignificant in international relations, can add more nuance to our understanding of Kuwait's foreign policy behavior. Local sources trace the interactions and dialogue between the political elite and members of society on a wide range of domestic and foreign issues. Therefore, they can be instrumental in gauging the degree to which society influences the perspective of the decision maker. At the same time, whereas Western archives provide us mainly with the perspective of the outsiders and how Kuwaiti decision makers represented their ideas to the UK or the US, for example. Local sources allow us to understand how these decision makers instead represented themselves in the domestic sphere to their publics, which fills the gap in the wider story of Kuwait's foreign policy. I would like to focus on the material that I examined in the second step of my methodology, which relates to the recovery of political discourses. So I examined sources from the 50s until the 70s. The 50s were characterized by increasing literacy, modernization of state institutions, and the development of a local press. They also witnessed the emergence of a very strong nationalist anti-colonial movement with which decision makers positively interacted. The periodicals I decided to use were Al-Ba'tha, Al-Iman, Al-Fajr, Al-Arabi, and Al-Kuwait Al-Yawm. The first three are represent popular views, while the remaining two are official publications reflecting the government's point of view. Al-Ba'tha was a monthly magazine issued by the Cairo-based Kuwaiti student mission, one of Kuwait's most prominent journals in the 1950s, and also reflects the ideas of the rising intelligentsia in Kuwait during this critical period. And upon completing their education abroad, many of Al-Ba'tha's editors and contributors joined the government apparatus. Therefore, the magazine represents a window into the worldview of Kuwait's leading bureaucrats. Al-Iman was a monthly magazine issued by the National Cultural Club, which was a front for the Kuwait's Arab nationalist opposition. And after that magazine was closed, the role of the Arab nationalist movement mouthpiece transferred to Al-Fajr, which was a weekly periodical issued by the Graduates Club. I also look at the government periodicals. The first is Al-Kuwait Al-Yawm, which is the official gazette issued by the Press and Publishing Department. This was headed by Sabah Al-Ahmed, who later on became the country's second foreign minister and obviously prime minister in New York, who passed away recently. Al-Kuwait Al-Yawm wasn't just a magazine that was reporting new laws and administrative developments, but it also issued statements on regional and political developments, for example, with the UAR or other issues that were happening in the Arab world at the time. And it had a very strong Arabist rhetoric. The second one is Al-Arabi, which is a literary magazine published by the same department in 1958. It was directed to the Arab world and not just to the Kuwaiti audience. It displayed a very strong pan-Arab sentiment, with the Press and Publishing Department declaring that the magazine aspired to, quote, do the sons of Arabism and national service, end quote. For the post-independence period, I use Al-Ra'y Al-Am and Al-Tali'a. and the Ministry of Information's annual reports. The first two sources are used to analyze popular discourses. And when I selected them, I wanted to kind of represent a wider spectrum of opinions. So Al-Ra'y al-Am represents, according to the British, the extreme conservatism of Kuwaiti merchant opinion and narrow Kuwaiti nationalism, whereas Al-Tali'a was ideologically opposed to Al-Ra'y al-Am, representing the Kuwaiti branch of the movement of Arab nationalists. And for the government part, I look at official speeches and the reports and the statements and the press interviews with different state representatives and ministers. I also analyzed these reports of the Ministry of Information, which detail the government's policies and government positions. They were started to be published from 1966, and they kind of offer some insight into how the government was working. I also looked at Al-Kuwait al-Yawm for some issues. So in conclusion, Kuwait's foreign policy cannot be reduced to a quest of security due to a heightened threat perception from neighboring states. Only through examining history and ideas can Kuwait's policies be completely explained. Depending solely on Western sources and archives is not enough. The incorporation of local sources is important to achieve this goal. These sources can illuminate the state-society dialogue taking place in the domestic sphere. Tracing these interactions enables us, the researchers, to understand the multifaceted layers of the relationship between the political elite and society and how they shape each other's worldviews and interpretation of global and regional issues. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Wafa. Wow, this sounds like really super comprehensive. And I can also really appreciate how much effort it is to kind of take a sliver of what you've done and make it sort of like, legible enough, in 20 minutes to a group of people who are not necessarily experts in your area. But really my takeaway was that, by looking at a variety of archives and actually a variety of intellectual currents that happened, in Kuwait in sort of the mid to late 20th century, you're able to show the reductionism of a neorealist approach to IR, meaning actually there were some really interesting things happening domestically that can also help us explain Kuwait's foreign policy. So this is sort of like my takeaway from that. I'm sure people have a whole bunch of questions. I'd love to maybe just have you comment or talk a little bit about why was it useful for you to also study Bahrain? So if you were able to make this argument about Kuwait, what usefulness is the Bahraini case to your analysis? And if you could just touch on, were there exactly the same archives or other archives that you used in the case of Bahrain?
So actually I thought having the comparative aspect in my thesis made the argument for Kuwait stand out even more, because sometimes when you propose this idea to others, you're like, well, they were just kind of like pandering to these ideas. They were doing this kind of looking at Arab nationalism and using it as a tool just to appease the public. But then when you look at Bahrain and you see kind of the drastic difference in Bahrain, and I can cover that a bit, just to explain why it was so different, then you'll see that Kuwait actually was different. Kuwait didn't just use it as an instrumentalist approach to kind of like just, show the public that they're adopting these ideas while they're kind of more interested in Western security guarantees. So in Kuwait and Bahrain, I use the exact same themes. So I look at state-society relations, I look at the role of external powers, and I also look at the state institutions. And when you compare, Bahrain and Kuwait are very good to compare because their developments or the institutional developments happen around the same time. They both also had a very active press in the 50s that is very, accessible, and that was also run by the intelligentsia, so kind of represented very similar worldviews. So I look at how, for example, in Bahrain, we didn't have as interactive a dialogue between the ruling elite and society, and that is to a large extent influenced by the degree of British internal meddling in Bahrain during that period, and how they've kind of made it almost not attractive for the rulers or the political elite to even engage with popular trends in society. And also look at the heavy centralization of the Bahraini state in comparison to the Kuwaiti one, because the decentralization in Kuwait is what allowed for this flow movement of ideas, whereas in Bahrain, the state was pretty much centralized in the early 20th century, which didn't really give any room for these kind of rivalries between different contending political elites or sheikhs to come and bring in their alliances with their popular forces, and through that shaping state institutions. So that kind of allows me to show how even prior to these states becoming independent, they had completely different processes of state formation. But then also when you look into ideas, it's also, you see how there's a little bit less engagement between the political elite and the popular trends in society. So there is always this criticism in the press in Bahrain that the government wasn't doing enough to promote these pan-Arab ideas. It wasn't doing enough to, support Arab causes or support the Palestinian refugees. And this kind of like stays on for a while, especially in the 50s. The unfortunate thing about Bahrain is that after 56, there is a kind of no press allowed until the late 60s because of the events of 1956. But you still have a lot of publications from like the early 50s till 56 that are very, very accessible right now and easy to look through. And then when you take that history of ideas and kind of these material structures and you look at foreign policy, you can see that Kuwait had a stronger commitment to these ideas, when it comes to, how they've interacted with the Arab-Palestinian cause, how they've dealt with, for example, their aid to South Yemen, which Bahrain was on the opposite side of that, or even, through their support of kind of like more the non-aligned movement, where Bahrain was kind of like, committed to it, but not as strongly as Kuwait was. And Kuwait states clearly in its foreign policy, it's a kind of public foreign policy agendas, is that it is committed to the idea of positive neutralism, which is something that Jamal Abdel Nasser advocated during that same period. In many ways, I argue that it kind of shows their closeness to the kind of the Cairo camp during that period. Also, Kuwait in many ways was, the where, the Dhafari revolution, kind of like a lot of members were there. So it kind of was a hub of anti-colonial activities, which Bahrain was not. And I think if I don't show that comparison to Bahrain, some people will dismiss these arguments about Kuwait, say, well, it's just, superficial. And, it's just like the rest of them. It just kind of like, promote itself that way. But at the end of the day, it was kind of like the other monarchies. And so I needed Bahrain to show that, no, it wasn't, because if you look at the same time, Bahrain was doing something else.
That's really great.
Was too long an answer, yeah.
No, that was excellent. And I think in some ways, what's really great about what you're doing by kind of choosing two cases within the Gulf to almost like demonstrate the differences is you're allowing us to see that often the term Gulf can be very flattening, right? Like so many things can be swept under it, when in fact those differences tell us something very interesting about the role that colonial history has played and continue to play on the relationship between state and society and cultural production. So I think that's really important. I'd love to open up the space to have other people kind of reflect or ask questions. I think I saw Lo indicating something. I don't know if you wanted to say something, but also other people as well.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for this talk. I was just thinking that, I think it was last year I attended a talk that was supposed to be about the conflict with Qatar, and the speakers, who were all American political scientists, basically proceeded to talk about Trump for an entire hour, and so that was extremely frustrating. And so it's very refreshing to hear precisely the type of intervention that your scholarship is doing. And I think, it's doing an intervention in terms of understanding Gulf states' foreign policy, but it's also making an intervention in precisely state-society relationships that, under the sort of blanket of the rentier state, have been considered as very unilateral sort of relationships, where societies basically don't matter, and you're showing the exact opposite. And also, in breaking down the heterogeneity of Gulf states, but also the internal variations within the Kuwaiti context, for example. And I was just, maybe one question that I have is, what is the status of that pan-Arab narrative? That's maybe a very far too big question, but what is the status of that pan-Arab narrative in Kuwait today, but also what is the status of that narrative about the history of Kuwait itself? And the reason I'm asking is because that's also a very anecdotal thing, but I visited the Kuwaiti pavilion at the expo in Dubai, and there was actually a huge section on aid that was very, very clearly sort of making that narrative about pan-Arabism. And that was, very prominently showing aid to Syria, for example, and to Syrian refugees, aid to Palestine, etc. And so I was wondering, how that's mobilized today in Kuwait.
I mean, before I get into that, I haven't had the time to do that in the talk, but I have to also acknowledge that, of course, not all parts of Kuwaiti society embraced this idea of Arabism or kind of this pan-Arab discourse, especially after independence. We see the rise of another movement that, it's usually termed as the Kuwait for the Kuwaitis, or Kuwait al-Kuwaitiyin, where they kind of attack the Arab nationalists for taking some of these positions. And that's a Ra'y al-Am in my thesis. It's the Ra'y al-Am that represents that point of view, though my argument is even when they had these kind of reservations about the status of Arabs within Kuwait, they didn't really adopt when it came to Arab issues, they were still very strongly Arabist, I would argue. And this kind of trend obviously continues. Sometimes the ruling elite will pander also to that trend, and they will adopt policies that will satisfy the kind of conservatives within Kuwaiti society. But I would say that there's still a very strong legacy of this pan-Arabist discourse in Kuwait. And it is very interesting to point that out, even after the invasion, of Kuwait in 1990 and the aftermath of that, when it came to the status of Palestinians in Kuwait and all of that happened. And it's always very impressive that Kuwait is still holds the strongest positions on the Palestinian issue, both on a official level as well as on the popular level. And you see that every time there is something happening in Palestine, very quickly people will gather and protest and demonstrate their solidarity with the Palestinians. And it's I think this is kind of why probably Kuwait hasn't really move towards normalizing its relations with Israel, in spite of the fact that most Gulf states are moving towards that trend in Kuwait, because also of the strength of the popular support for and solidarity of Palestine and the kind of role of the parliament in Kuwait, that this would not have been even a popular policy, would have caused a lot of anger and dissatisfaction amongst the Kuwaitis. So the pan-Arab idea is still there. And I think especially when it comes to Palestine, the Kuwaitis are still, very strongly committed to that issue, both on a popular and official level.
I wanted to ask about first, I want to thank you. This is an amazing research you've done, and in particular, throwing out a wider net to cover what was once considered marginal sources of material, these publications, and also the popular publications. But in looking at the popular writings, where do you see the engagement of women in nation formation, in particular in relation to Kuwait, and the strong, contribution of women in literature, for example, or in some extent, we know there is a large number of females among the hired teachers, whether mostly in the education department, possibly. This my limited knowledge, yani. And these women, while they were contributing, what role did they play in the formation of this discourse and national narrative? But I thank you so much for introducing these. And my second question would be about Jam'iyyat al-Kharrijin al-Kuwaitiyya, the graduate, I can't remember the exact translation title, I think the society is Graduate Society or Society of Kuwaiti University graduate of the sort, and if you have used their resources and publications in your research. Thank you.
So to the question of women, it's interesting because right before I started this talk, I was just thinking someone will ask me about women. I don't know, that maybe it was telepathic. It's these sources that I look at are very expansive, and especially when I look at Talia, there's a lot of women contributions to that to the magazine slash newspaper, because it was a magazine newspaper at different times, and there's a lot of focus obviously on women issues and women kind of liberation, but there is also a lot of talk about women and their involvement in anti-colonial movements, or in their involvement in kind of Arabist activities. For example, one of the annual reports so it's a more official document, it talked about the women participating in events to support the war effort in 1967. And you see also when there's always pictures of protests and demonstrations in Kuwait, there's a lot of pictures also of women being involved in these demonstrations. I put some on Twitter a while back with women kind of side by side with Kuwaiti men going out and marching. So that's kind of they definitely were there, and I feel like that I should have included them more, and that's something that has kind of occupied me after I submitted, that I should also, because there is a muthaqafin, but there's also muthaqafat as well. So the women, the Kuwaiti and Arab women in Kuwait also were engaging with these ideas, because they were kind of part of that same social fabric. They were engaging with the same ideas. When they started going abroad, they also kind of interacted with the same intellectual trends that the Kuwaiti men were interacting with. So they were much committed to the same ideas as the other members of the intelligentsia, and they saw eye to eye on many of these issues, with also their focus on women liberation and women role in society. So Talia has a lot of political cartoons that kind of pick at that, in the kind of like promoting women liberation, and as well as a lot of articles talking about women contributors writing about their position in society. The Bahraini press as well, as early as the 50s, talked about women issues, though sometimes it came out later. In a later newspaper in the 70s, I found out that some of those contributions were done by men, because they couldn't find women who would write, so they wrote about the issues of women using female pseudonyms. But it showed that also they stood on, they kind of like were with women, kind of education and women freedom and all
awesome.
of that.
Amin style, yani.
Yeah. So it's but there are some women, especially like in Bahrain, there were a couple of famous sisters, Shahla and Badriya Khalfan, who were out in protest in 1956, and they were young girls and carried Jamal Abdel Nasser pictures, and so it's not like they didn't exist. But I think we see them more in the 60s, especially in Bahrain. We see them more in the 60s because they were much more involved in the labor kind of student movements then, because there was more women educated at the time and more women going abroad. Sometimes it was through the recruitment of their brothers or family members who were involved in these movements, and they will bring their sisters along or their cousins. And then the Jamiyat al-Kharijin, so I look at Al-Fajr, which was their publication, but apart from that, I haven't really looked at much. I do have to admit that because of the kind of like the very ambitious project that I took upon myself, I had to kind of look at snapshots of all of these sources. So I look at British archives, and then I choose a number of publications to focus on from Kuwait. But I feel like there is a much larger project to be done to uncover a lot of more. I kind of just, I think, brush the surface with these sources, and there's like an iceberg under all of that also someone else has to pick up and uncover. I think historians do a great work when they look at these sources, and I think it's up to us political scientists and international relations people to finally embrace these sources as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dan, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this, Wafa. This has been very illuminating. And I guess my question is more geared towards the practical process of your research. So these really valuable resources that, as Salwa was saying, were once considered marginal. I'm just wondering, what is the current archival status of them? I mean, certainly they are housed in different locations and perhaps to different degrees of maintenance or comprehensiveness. So if you can speak to that, both within the Kuwaiti and the Bahraini process, please.
So I'll start with Bahrain just because I haven't given it as much. So Bahrain was very interesting. First, obviously, the British archives, those, you just go to the archives either in the British Library or Kew, and that's where you access them. But when it comes to the local sources, so in Bahrain, they've done this actually good effort of compiling most of the press, starting from the, earlier, because Bahrain was, there's a Bahrain newspaper which was published during World War II, but then, and they compiled them all in the basement of the National Library. So you can access them there. Though sometimes you always end up with some missing issues. So there's one of these very important 1950s newspapers called Al Qafila, which was the mouthpiece of the opposition, reformist opposition at the time. And they had 2 volumes and you could only find 1 volume. And then through having scheduled a meeting with the library's directorate and going there, I found the other volume just sitting there on the shelf. I don't know if it made its way finally back to the library at a certain point because I haven't been since then, but that's how I got to see the second volume, which was the more interesting volume because it talked more about the demonstrations and the reform movement. In Bahrain also, I was trying to find textbooks from the 50s and I went to the directorate and asked for them, but I couldn't find any ones from that period. And the way I found those textbooks was by contacting, I don't know if, I'm sure maybe some Emiratis are also like that, where there are a lot of people in the Gulf who like collecting kind of antiques, or they're antique collectors, and they just keep them on display. And there's this really kind man from Harrag who was actually a big fan of Jamal Abdel Nasser. His son's name is Abdel Nasser, and he has a mini museum in his house. And I established this relationship with him and went to visit him a few times, and then eventually he opened up this bookcase where he collected all of these textbooks of Bahrain that were published starting the 1950s. And that's how I found those textbooks. And he was really kind. He allowed him to take pictures of them, as many as I want. He said, as long as you just credit that you got them from me, take whatever pictures you want. So sometimes those probably don't even exist in the Ministry of Education, but they were through these different kind of antique networks. Some of them have Instagram accounts. I think most of them operate through Instagram. If you establish connection with them, they have something. They would have a paper here or a document here or a book there. That you might not be able to find elsewhere. Of course, with Bahrain, I also, for the kind of underground opposition, I was in the AUB library, the Jafat library, and that's where I found a lot of microfilms of the popular liberation fronts of Bahrain and the National Liberation Front. I think it was when they were there, they kind of it's like very horrible quality microfilms. And I know some places they're trying to digitize them better, but that's where I found some of the underground literature that isn't even accessible in Bahrain because it's much more controversial. So that wasn't the case with Bahrain, if I remember correctly. In the case of Kuwait, it's also in different places. So you have there's a really decent now newspaper archives and magazines archive in Kuwait Library. There's a very great archivist who works there, and he is very kind. He always helps you out with everything. So you can access most of them there, including at Dalia. I think maybe Sliger is interested in that. But there is also some similar collection in Kuwait University. So sometimes some issues are missing here and might be finding there, and vice versa. And also the minutes of the Parliament Assembly, National Assembly, you'd find them also in these archives. And Kuwait Library also has a section for official kind of reports and publications or government publications, and that's where you access them. So that's where you would find, I think they have a better collection there. It's of those sources as well. I'm trying to think what else I've used in the case of Kuwait. Also, in addition to those sources, I also use memoirs, and I treat them as primary sources in a way. So you look at the memoirs of Dr. Ahmed Khatib, like Dr. Ahmed Khatib in Kuwait. You look at the memoirs of the late Abdurrahman al-Bakr in case of Bahrain, and you can use them as kind of a way to respond to some, because sometimes you read a story and this memoir, and then you read it in the British records, and you try to make the connection, because obviously you get different versions. And sometimes even when you read them in these two, in the British records, and you read them in the memoirs, and then you also read them in the newspapers themselves. So that's how you kind of build the story. It's building blocks using these different versions of the same story. And so it's kind of like that kind of effort. And usually also consulting other researchers in the field, especially historians, because they're ones who have went through the archives and they would tell you where to go. I mean, I like the historical method, but I don't think I can claim to be a historian because I wasn't trained as a historian, though I really love working with these archives, and they can be really good in pointing you to where to find these places. Yeah.
This was wonderful. Actually, your last response was basically answered the question I was going to pose about the archives. It's fascinating because I remember when I was doing my master's, I also had to kind of deal with the National Archives here in the Emirates. And sometimes these places have the material and sometimes they don't. And you have to kind of go digging elsewhere. And it's, that's what made me end up working on like, medievalist stuff, because it's, a lot of it got digitized over the years. And so I kind of sit around and Google and like search around until I find something. But some of the manuscripts, for example, showed up on Muntadiyat at some point, and I just downloaded these things. So yeah, it's fascinating, you finding these collectors of textbooks. So yeah, thank you for this like wonderful talk.
Thank you. I wanted to add also that Kuwait Library now is doing a really good effort at digitizing a lot of them, and even their microfilm machine is really good. It can download directly into a PDF with really high quality. So Ra'y al-Am, I could get it really high quality, and you can easily, like, the guy there is really, his name is Khalid Din, and he's really kind. He lets you take the, you can even ask him to kind of digitize certain copies of things for you, and then he would do it within a few days. He'll send you by email, the digital versions, high quality. So better than the Bahraini library, I would say, when it comes to now having a proper system in place.
That's great. Salwa, you have your hand up as well.
Just a quick one. I know we're out of time, but I want to first, of course, thank you again for this amazing talk, because it so much fits into what we're doing here at Al Mawrid and Haraka in particular. And looking at these archives, which we could gather from the artists and collectors, give a context to what we now are looking at the artists from a distance practically, but then you're looking at the writing, artist journals, which we try to digitize, but we prefer not to remove from its country of origin. We believe archives should remain in their country of origin where they belong, and we digitize and return or digitize on site. But another source I might share with you would be the material gathered by PhD graduates such as yourself. And so we have now a new section where we actually take in the material given to us by these new recent postdoc or even dissertations written as long ago. And this way we keep them, preserve them in our archives for others. So they would have a copy of the dissertation itself, as well as documentation that they had gathered. It could be original, but all of them are primary documents or relevant documents that could lead other future researchers into new avenues and new sources. So that's another source that I could share.
So is this available on a website, or how do you access this?
We are a very recently established organization. So it would be about a year before we start seeing part of the archive online. We currently have the Akasa photography part of the archive that Shumun spoke about. That was started a few years back. So we adopted that project, and you can find the photographs online. For example, as I said earlier, I'm working with Inji Aflatun's archive, and part of it, of course, her prominency in the women's movement in Egypt. And today I found in the photography archive, which is a completely different documentary photography, 2 albums on women, all photographs of women associations in Egypt from the 50s and 60s. And they're right there in our collection. So I didn't have to go very far. So we need to be very creative in seeking sources for material. But we hope the dissertations and their accompanying material is not a priority for us now to digitize, because they would be given to us, and we would acquire them.
It's
That
really
sounds like a great
wonderful.
project, yeah.
Yeah, that's really wonderful, Salwa. And actually what comes to mind is a conversation that I was having with Van around kind of, some of the work that we're hoping to do, in the next year or so in the context of the noted Arab Center for Art, which is that in some ways, kind of, as we attempt to put together an archive of sorts, we'd like to really bring into the fold the kind of reflections and experiences of people who themselves have been working with archives, who've either made their own archives, but also who have pushed back against certain ideas of the archive. And so Wafa, I remember the story that you told me about the initial pushback you were getting in your own research about, but it can't be real, it can't be really kind of this domestic political activism. I mean, and until you can actually be like, look, we have journals, this is evidence of actual things happening, And so it's these stories, honestly, that are in addition to the archive itself, but so important because the new generation of researchers, the present generation of researchers, who I feel are facing the exact challenge that you faced, but each person in their own discipline and separately. And so what would it mean, for all of us who are not historians, I certainly am not, but to actually really learn from historians about the importance of historical material, about contextualizing things and having these kind of cross-disciplinary, conversations. So really, I just want to tell you that you've inspired me for sure. And it looks like from looking at other people's faces on this call, many other people as well. And for sure, we're going to keep you in the loop, with some of our other work coming forward, inshallah. And if we do have a gathering of people, I really, really hope that you'll also join us to share, some of your more recent work. But really, thank you so much, Wafa.
Thank you very much, May and Salwa and everyone else here. I'm really happy that I got invited to present my work to you and to hear your points of view. And this is a great initiative, and I would hope to stay in the loop, definitely.